Charles Darwin is about as close to a patron saint as you can get in science. He is almost universally beloved and respected. And the reason for that is twofold. First, in coming up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, he had what has been somewhat grandiosely called the single greatest idea that has ever passed through a human mind. But second, he also exemplified the particular human qualities that scientists admire and aspire to themselves. So he was not only just brilliant, but he was creative and methodical, and he was rigorous, and he was intellectually humble, and he was kind, and he was a fantastic writer. But despite all that, this hagiography, this lauding of Darwin is somewhat misplaced. We love our stories of heroes, of these great men and women, these lone geniuses who came and they unleashed on an unsuspecting world their brilliant, fully formed idea. But that's not really how science works. And in fact, it's not how ideas work. In Darwin's time and in his circle, in the air were all the ideas that Darwin needed to put together the theory of evolution. People were talking about these things already. So take, for instance, the idea of common descent. The idea that all the organisms which exist now descended from one or a few original organisms. So this is Immanuel Kant speaking in the late 1700s. Despite all the variety among these forms, they seem to have been produced according to a common archetype. And this analogy among them reinforces our suspicion that they are actually akin, produced by a common original mother. Even Darwin's grandfather, who of course Darwin knew, was stumbling upon something extremely close to the ideas that Darwin eventually published. Again, common descent. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament? Those ideas were in the air. The idea of the transmutation of species, that one species can turn into another, was famously introduced by the French philosopher Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet, the Chevalier de Lamarck, known as Lamarck. He had this idea, and actually had a full theory, with some parts which turned out to be quite wrong, of evolution himself. And that was published the year that Darwin was born. So all these ideas were already floating around. They'd been produced by a society that had already dredged up a lot of the foundations of evolutionary theory. And if Darwin hadn't come along, somebody else would have put together the pieces and come up with the theory of evolution. And in fact, somebody else did. This is Alfred Russel Wallace, who is recognized to be the co-founder of the theory of evolution, who independently, alongside Darwin, came up with all the major parts of Darwin's theory, of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So why is it that we hold Darwin in such high regard? Well, let's go into the brief history of these two men and their coming up with the theory of evolution, because it presages a bunch of the debates that continue to resonate down from the ages. What these two men disagreed about are still the things that we societally disagree about when it comes to evolution, and in particular when it comes to evolutionary psychology. Okay, so let's start this story in 1809, and it ends in 1913, but really it doesn't really ever end. 1809, that's when Charles Darwin was born. 1823, that's when Alfred Russel Wallace was born. He had the misfortune of being just 14 years younger than Darwin, and so 14 years behind Darwin's little head start. So everything that happens here above the line, that's what's going on in Darwin's life, and everything that happens here below the line, that's what's going on in Wallace's life. So 1831, Darwin is 22 years old, and Wallace is 8. Darwin goes on the HMS Beagle. He goes on this voyage that takes him from England down beneath South America, over to Australia under Africa, under the Cape of Good Hope, and then all the way back to England. And this is this magical voyage that's talked about in scientific lore, is where Darwin starts collecting all the evidence and putting together all the ideas that eventually become his theory of evolution. He first notes, you see in his notebooks, the first tinglings of the ideas that are his theory of evolution in 1837. So there's this famous diagram that he writes, which is the evolutionary tree, where he explains what he thinks is going on, how these species went from being common ancestors, spreading out into the variety of species that we see now. And you can see there at the very top left of it, he writes, I think, he's putting this together. At that point, he's 28 years old. Now, both Darwin and Wallace read the works of Thomas Malthus. That ended up being instrumental for the two of them. Malthus had this idea of population, where when organisms reproduce, their numbers tend to increase geometrically, exponentially. So say two people have 4 kids, and then each of those people have 2 kids each. It'll increase exponentially rather than linearly. But the resources only increase linearly. The point of this is that Malthus felt like there was always a struggle where not everybody could survive, because the environment was outstripped by the population, which meant that the population was kept down by the fact that, again, not everybody got to survive. Not everybody got to make it through the sieve of the struggle between them. And so for Darwin and Wallace, they looked at that and they saw the obvious implication that, well, not everybody gets to survive, and it's not completely random who gets to survive and who doesn't. There's something about the individuals within a species that survive, and there's something about the ones that don't. And that would be a selection, a natural selection of the fitter, the more adaptive of those individuals. Anyways, so Darwin first published about his theories of evolution in an essay that he wrote in 1844. A few years later, Wallace leaves on his own mission, actually inspired by Darwin. I should mention that Darwin is from a very prominent scientific, scholarly family. Wallace is not. Wallace is from a poorer family. He grows up admiring Darwin from afar and emulates some of his behavior, going on this big voyage as the naturalist on board. That one takes him to South America. Eventually it capsizes. Alfred Russel Wallace is left in an open boat for 10 days waiting to be saved, which he eventually is, and then lives off the insurance money from all the specimens he lost for decades, essentially. In 1851, Darwin's eldest daughter dies. Now, that's an interesting thing which happened to both of them. Much later in his life, Alfred Russel Wallace's favorite son also died. This was a common experience they had, but they reacted very differently to this. Alfred Russel Wallace became much more spiritual, much more religious when his child died, whereas the exact opposite happened for Darwin. Darwin had initially, when he was at Cambridge as a student, had been training to be, of all things, a pastor, but he became quite the atheist in his life, and especially that was accelerated by the loss of his daughter. Wallace first publishes on his evolutionary theories in a paper on the monkeys of the Amazon. He later gets much more specific and much closer to the ultimate theory of evolution by natural selection that they both put out when he publishes On the Law which has regulated the introduction of species. He sends that book through an intermediary to Darwin because, again, this guy, he idolizes Darwin. Sends his paper to Darwin. Darwin reads it, kind of misses the point. Darwin has been working on his own theory of evolution now for many years, nearly 2 decades, really. And he reads Wallace's paper and says, "Yeah, it's pretty good, but it's still creationism. It's not. He doesn't really get it." But Wallace did get it. When Wallace then sends his next book, that then clues Darwin in. He's like, "This guy gets it. This guy gets the theory that I've been working on for 20 years, and he's starting to publish on it. And now I'm worried that I'm not going to get the credit for having come up with the theory myself. I'm worried about being scooped. Now, in that case, Darwin is the much more prominent scientist. Alfred Russel Wallace is way away somewhere in Malaysia sending these papers off and has real no in the scientific community. At this point, Darwin could just say, okay, you know what, I'm just going to rush and publish my thing. I've been working on it forever. I was the first one to come up with it. I want the credit. I'm going to publish it. But he doesn't do that. Instead, what he does is he says, I'm going to co-publish. I'm going to bring this young Alfred Russel Wallace, nobody scientist, in with me, and we're going to co-publish a paper together, and we're going to present it to the Scientific Society, which he does in 1858. They have this joint paper which is presented to the Linnaean Society, which is the premier biological society at the time. Now, I mentioned that Alfred Russel Wallace is in Malaysia at this time. He doesn't have the opportunity to assent to this because, you know, this is not email time. They don't have like Slack. They're sending letters back and forth. It takes too long for this to happen. So Darwin just goes ahead with this without Wallace's permission and presents this paper to the society. But actually, Darwin's not there either. Alfred Russel Wallace is over in Malaysia. Darwin has another child of his die. And so Darwin's at home grieving the death of his child. Wallace is out in Malaysia. This, basically the greatest idea in all of biology is presented to the Biological Society, and nobody really notices. Nobody gets it. Nobody gets the significance. It's only in 1859 when Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species that the public clues in, that the scientific community clues in. This book sold a ton, even in its day. This was dynamite news when it was finally published. And this is where we really tend to mark the beginning of our understanding of evolution, 1859. One of the interesting things that happened is that Darwin recognized how explosive the theory was because he recognized the implications of what the theory of evolution meant, not just about the animals, which he was writing about, but about humans themselves. In fact, everybody recognized it as soon as you start reading the book. But in order to prevent the controversy and make sure that the idea was accepted without ruffling unnecessarily too many feathers, Darwin didn't talk about humans. He didn't talk about the implications for humans. He just left it implied. But soon after he published it, 1863, T.H. Huxley, who was much more of sort of a shit disturber at the time, he published the book Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, very directly about what the implications are for human beings. And it's in that book that we see this famous diagram. You've seen the many variants of this diagram where you see the ascent of man, basically us moving from more rudimentary species to ultimately a human being. There's a lot that's wrong with this diagram. I don't want to get into it now, but that's where it first appears, and then it becomes, you know, this great meme for the next 150 years. Even Wallace gets in on that. He publishes in the next year his own book, which gets into the implications for humans. Though, let's put a star on that and get back to it. Eventually, moved by what everybody else is saying, Darwin realizes, you know what, I'm going to put my word on this because I think these other people aren't getting it exactly right. At that point, Wallace starts getting really into spiritualism, which is only accelerated when his kid dies. Anyways, back to Darwin. So in 1871, seeing Huxley publish on humans, seeing Wallace publish on humans, seeing everybody wanting to talk about the evolution of humans, Darwin publishes The Descent of Man. He dies in 1882. Before he dies, though, he does one last thing for Wallace. Now, Wallace, as I mentioned, was from a poorer family. He lived off insurance for a long time. He always struggled to make ends meet. He was always under some sort of financial hardship, despite the massive contributions he was making to science. What Darwin did from his place of prominence at that point is, before he died, the year before he died, he made sure that Wallace was getting a government pension so that Wallace would be able to have money in his older age. He would get money from the British government for his contributions. It's an admirable thing for Darwin to do. Now, Wallace, for his part, spends the last years of his life being a political activist. He was a suffragette. Can you be a male suffragette? He was a male suffragette. He fought for women's rights. He fought for the poor. He was a big pacifist. He was really against war, and then ultimately died on the eve of World War I. But before he died as well, he did something actually very nice for Darwin, posthumously. He published the very first textbook on evolution, and he called it Darwinism. And that's where we get the word. So why is it that we credit Darwin and not Wallace with being the originator of the theory of evolution? Why is it that we call it Darwinism, not Wallaceanism or Darwin-Wallaceanism, other than it sounds stupid? Well, even though they both got the broad strokes, there were critical areas on which they disagreed. And those areas, those disagreements, like I mentioned, they echo down through the ages, because those areas were particularly important when it comes to evolutionary psychology. So Wallace resisted the full implications of his own theory. He recognized what those implications were, but he balked before he accepted them fully. He said that natural selection, which could explain things like fingers, it couldn't account for the human faculties, the mental faculties of things like mathematics, art, music, humor, and what he called metaphysical musing, spiritualism, which he loved so much. This is a pretty long quote that I'm going to give you, but it's worth getting into because it gets at exactly his thinking about the topics we'll talk about. He says, "The special faculties we have been discussing clearly point to the existence in man of something which he has not derived from his animal progenitors, something which we may best refer to as being of a spiritual essence, or nature. Thus alone we can understand," and here it comes, "the constancy of the martyr, the unselfishness of the philanthropist, the devotion of the patriot, the enthusiasm of the artist, and the resolute and persevering search of the scientific worker after nature's secrets." He says those things can't be understood from the same natural processes that created the animals. They themselves have a spiritual origin. He continues, "Thus we may perceive that the love of truth, the delight in beauty, the passion for justice, and the thrill of exultation with which we hear of any act of courageous self-sacrifice are the workings within us of a higher nature, which has not been developed by the means of the struggle for material existence, that is, by the means of natural selection." He's putting his cards out on the table. He's saying that, and by the way, he wrote this in his textbook, Darwinism. So he said that there were 3 points at which natural selection was not enough. It was not enough to create these innovations in life. And in fact, there had to be something else. There had to be some external force to help the process along, some spiritual force that had a hand in it. And he said this were the initial creation of life from inorganic matter, right? So the abiogenesis thing that we talked about last lecture. The development of consciousness, the development of the phenomenological subjective experience of being, and the development of the higher human faculties, all the things that he's talking about here in this paragraph, and everything that we'll talk about for the rest of the course. And as a result, he felt that if a spiritual force was intervening, if it wasn't a blind force, but there was something pushing it along, that means it was trying to get somewhere. So he believed that evolution was teleological, which means that it had a goal state. It had a purpose. It was trying to accomplish something. It was teleological and directional. It was moving towards something. And he felt that it was leading ultimately and purposefully to the development of the human spirit. Why else would a spiritual force push us in the direction where these things were able to develop if it didn't intend for evolution to eventually take us to the spot where this human nature is created? That's what Wallace believed, but that's not what Darwin believed. So Darwin accepted the full implications. He looked right into the eye of his theory and accepted what it implied. In a letter that Darwin wrote to Wallace, by the way, this is interesting. Remember I mentioned that Wallace idolized Darwin. Darwin respected Wallace, but he didn't idolize Wallace. And as a result, we tend to only have one side of the correspondence between them, because whenever Darwin would write Wallace a letter, Wallace would keep it really nicely and well preserved. Whenever Wallace would write Darwin, well, we don't know what happened to those letters, but Darwin didn't keep them as nicely preserved. Anyways, so he wrote in this letter, 1857, on the eve of when they were to put out their joint paper, he said, "I go further than you." Darwin said in The Origin, he said, "In the distant future, I see open field for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation. That is the foundation of evolution." And he was right. And in that sense, he is sort of the first evolutionary psychologist. He believed and this is a theory that he introduced in The Descent of Man. He believed that, okay, so maybe natural selection, the struggle for survival, can't explain all these things like mathematics and art and wit, but sexual selection can. Sexual selection, you guys will read more about it in your readings, but that's like, well, you develop adaptive traits not just because they allow you to survive, but also because they allow you to be selected by the other sex as somebody they want to reproduce with. You have to convince somebody to sleep with you in order to pass down your genes into the next generation. And what better way to convince somebody to sleep with you than with mathematics? And that's why mathematics evolved, according to Darwin. Now, critically, Darwin felt that natural selection could explain it all. There was no need to inject some other spiritual force here. Natural selection was entirely capable for producing even the higher human faculties. And what that meant is that there's no qualitative difference between the humans and the brutes, that is the animals. It's one of degree and not of kind. We're made of the same stuff by the same process. And then equally, if not more critically, he said, evolution doesn't have a direction. He didn't believe, like Wallace, that we were going somewhere. Instead, evolution was a blind process that simply selected for whatever would best fit the environment that it happened to be in at that moment. It wasn't trying to get somewhere. It had no guiding purpose behind it. And that's critical, because what that means is that there is no moral implication of what is adaptive. If something is good from an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't mean it's good morally. That is a critical point, because there's a lot of our psychology that is adapted, that we've evolved to have, even though it's not the greatest, not the most socially desirable, not the most moral thing for us to possess. We're going to go into that a lot more throughout the course. We're going to go into a lot more in the next lecture even. But before we jump to that, I want to just take a moment to dwell on how momentous an event what we've talked about in this lecture was in the history of our species. Your first readings, the one by Stuart Williams, puts it really nicely when he says that a fragment of the earth, a fragment called Charles Darwin, finally understood how he got here, or something like that. It's very poetic. It's nice. I told you guys last lecture how there have been 200,000 years since our species first evolved, Homo sapiens first evolved. We've been anatomically modern humans living on this planet for 200,000 years. There were 10,000 generations of people just like you and me, with brains just as big as yours and mine, that have passed through this world. So you can think of this grid as representing those 10,000 generations. Each one of these little squares is one generation, from the very first one to the most recent one, your generation. Now, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of generations to have been on this planet. We didn't have agriculture or permanent settlements till there. And we didn't have writing until there. There was no Jesus until there. And there was no Charles Darwin until there, 8 generations ago. Now, what that means is that there have only been 8 generations out of the last 10,000 generations, and actually of all the generations of our ancestor species before that, to understand how we got here. That little fraction, those little 8 generations, and you and me happened to be born during one of those 8 generations. And that's what I mean when I say that we were born into a weird moment. But the very discovery of evolution is actually part of the evolutionary story of our species. How we connect the dots between the last lecture and this one, how we understand how we could become an organism and we could build a society that was able to comprehend its own origins, well, that's actually what's going to take us the rest of the term to understand.